something she hadn't experienced recently, which seemed strange. We sat her under the shade of a tree, and she started saying strange things, like my grandfather was in danger and witches were flying above us. Placing my hand on her forehead, I thought she might have a fever, but her skin was cold as ice. I called my father to check on her, and we decided it was necessary to take her to the doctor. However, upon arriving, my mother seemed to regain her senses, as if she had been in a trance. She didn't remember anything she had said moments earlier. My father, in a hurry, went back to work while I, being the youngest, stayed to watch over my mom, who kept insisting on going to the field. Of course, I didn't let her. With 4 fewer hands, the work was much more challenging than expected. As the sun began to set, we started hearing noises among the crops. It sounded as if a large animal or a person was walking through, rustling the corn plants. Our family dog, who always accompanied us, would usually wander off for a bit, but that afternoon, it stayed close to my mother. It was thanks to a bark that we realized someone was watching us from some nearby trees. My brother Jordy noticed a crouching figure on one of the branches. It must have been there for a couple of hours as we hadn't seen anyone approach. The person was difficult to make out due to the dim light, but we could see their silhouette moving among the branches. "Who are you?" my father asked sternly, but there was no reply. "It must be a thief," said one of my brothers. "If you don't leave now, you won't leave in one piece," my father shouted, gripping his sharp machete. Suddenly, the figure jumped down and vanished into the brush. At that moment, we heard a chilling laugh that filled us with an indescribable sense of terror, like a cold shadow passing over us. My father reminded us that night was approaching, and we still had a 2-kilometer walk through desolate terrain. We decided to leave everything as it was and head home. My mother, concerned, took my hand and pulled out the image of Saint Isidore the farmer. We began walking, and I noticed she was murmuring under her breath, her gaze fixed straight ahead. My father and brothers followed behind, machetes in hand. Suddenly, the dog barked frantically. We looked in all directions but saw nothing. We thought it might be the thief following us or trying to attack, but then we realized the dog was barking at the sky. My mother nearly fainted. Above us, we saw 3 fireballs spinning in circles, emitting a sort of glowing aura. We all huddled together while the terrified dog crawled low to the ground as if trying to escape something. My parents began praying to Saint Isidore, and we followed suit, hoping it would fend off whatever was pursuing us. But then we heard laughter from the sky, the same haunting laughter we had heard moments earlier. My mother, squeezing my hand tightly, didn't realize she was hurting me. We stood silent, watching as the fireballs slowly descended, spinning above us. When they got close enough, my father whispered for us to run to the fork near the hill we called Cerro Gallo. The locals had many stories about those lights. Some said people who tried to approach them never returned. Others claimed the lights were witches gathering for their rituals. It was said the witches couldn't cross certain boundaries because years ago the area's first settlers had made a pact, agreeing to sacrifice one child in exchange for the witches not attacking everyone. Hearing my father's words, I felt a tug on my arm. My mother, without waiting, started running as fast as she could. The distance to the fork was about 1 kilometer, close to where we had tied up the cow. My older brothers ran to protect us while the lights followed, laughing as if enjoying what was about to happen. My mother kept praying, mentioning my grandfather's name as if she believed he was in danger. As we neared the fork, adrenaline drove us forward, and I believed it was Saint Isidore answering our prayers. However, the fireballs sped up, moving ahead of us to block our path. Fear turned to terror. We realized these were witches looking for a sacrifice. It seemed they were after me, the youngest. The witches hovered as if waiting for us to make a decision. Suddenly, my father ran into the brush, leaving us at the mercy of the witches. My scream was gut-wrenching. I thought he had abandoned us to save himself. My brothers hugged us, bracing for the worst. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. Then we heard movement in the grass again. What we saw was my father, accompanied by a completely naked man with a rope around his neck. The man approached the witches, shouting threats and introducing himself as Al Mazatlico. Hearing his words, the witches rose into the air and flew toward the hill, letting us pass. My father and the man shook hands and walked home without looking back. When we arrived, we found my grandmother crying inconsolably at the door because my grandfather was having seizures, and she didn't know how to help. My mother approached him, placed the saint's image on his chest, and began to pray. Little by little, my grandfather calmed down. The foam at his mouth ceased, and so did his trembling. My grandmother told us that around midday, a woman had come asking for water. My grandfather had let her drink from the well, and the woman thanked us before leaving, and from that moment he began to feel pain all over his body. A few hours later he had those convulsions. When he was finally calm and lucid, he revealed to us that he had been visited by the witches of the hill. That was quite strange since they were not allowed to come down to that area. However, something had upset the witches and they were supposedly coming after us. When we told my grandfather everything that had happened, he explained to my father that he had been tied to the Mazatlico. My father replied that he had found him disoriented and thought it best to keep him tied until he regained his senses. That day I discovered that the cow we had seen in the morning was actually a man known in the region, a supposed sorcerer who took the form of a cow to move between towns and get food. He was known for practicing various religions including Santeria, and mastered diverse techniques used by shamans and babalaos. He wasn't a malicious person, but sometimes he disappeared for long periods, and during those times the witches would cause all sorts of mischief. The Mazatlico said it was crucial to keep the witches on the hill, close to their magic, to prevent them from causing problems. That day my father and brothers approached the tree, and he placed an herb in the animal's mouth, ensuring it stayed calm and did not transform, at least until he decided to undo the binding. When we encountered the witches, my father's only option was to release the Mazatlico, fearing that in his madness he might harm us. Fortunately that night, the man helped us drive them away, announcing that he had returned and that, at least for a while, they could not approach the towns or take children. To this day we still own those lands and work in agriculture. We no longer need to walk as we now have a truck to transport us. My grandfather passed away last year, taking with him one of the last family members who knew the legend of the Mazatlico and the witches. Many people now living in the area who come from other cities are unaware of these stories and seem to ignore what happens. However, it is a reality that even they have begun to report encounters with fire spheres seen dancing through the hills and approaching people in a threatening manner. My family is now scattered since my siblings have formed their own families. For now, I am the only child who remains in this place. My parents continue working from dawn to dusk, and for the past few months, they've noticed that the Mazatlico no longer comes near the towns, which might mean the witches are returning to seek offerings, whether benign or malevolent. When I turned 20, I started working as an operator for the transport company Tres Garras. I'm sure many of you know it or have at least heard of it. My father had already retired, so I decided to follow in his footsteps at this company. Now I am 24, and in these 4 years of traveling the country's roads, I've experienced things worth telling. Some good, others not so pleasant, and some that have left me utterly terrified. Today I'm going to share one of those experiences. It happened on May 27, 2022. My journey began in Mexico City, heading to the town of Paracho, Michoacán. Upon arrival, I reported to the base to collect all the documentation for the load and the necessary information about the route and the recipient. I waited until they finished loading the truck, and as soon as it was ready I set off. Crossing the entire state of Querétaro went without a hitch, and upon entering Michoacán, everything was still calm. I passed Pátzcuaro and Uruapan without any problems. However, as I neared the town of Capacuaro, less than 5 kilometers from the delivery point, other truck drivers informed me via radio about an illegal roadblock set up by criminals who had already robbed several drivers, even taking the trucks. I decided to stop immediately at the first spot I saw and turned on the hazard lights. I stayed there for several minutes, unsure whether to turn around and head the opposite way or wait a couple of hours until the roadblock was gone. While stopped, I suddenly felt the urge to relieve myself. Looking out the windows, I saw that there was a school by the side of the road. I turned off the engine, stepped out cautiously with some fear, thinking someone might come to check on me. Quickly, I climbed back into the truck and turned on the radio, where reports of robberies continued to come in. I grabbed my baseball bat, which I always carry, not just for checking the tires but also for any unforeseen events, and stayed alert. Everything was very dark and at first I couldn't see clearly who it was. As they got closer, I managed to see better. It was a thin man, not very tall, wearing a black sweater and blue jeans. He walked past the right side of the truck, which was even darker, so I looked out the mirror to observe him, but I couldn't see him anymore. I sat on the passenger side looking for any sign of him, but still couldn't find him. The thought of him hiding and having bad intentions unnerved me. Maybe he had crouched down or crawled under the truck's trailer. Grabbing my bat again and preparing to get out, I suddenly saw him standing right in front of me. The lights were off, but I could make him out from a safe distance. It occurred to me to yell, "What do you want? Did you lose something?" while waving my bat strongly, trying to send a warning. However, the man didn't move or even bother to look at me. He just stood there staring at the truck. I took a couple of steps forward to let him know I was ready to defend myself, but what he did made me hesitate. He smiled from ear to ear, and